welcome again to Chile Talk. I'm Neil Davidson, of course. I'm with Pete Leihy. Our last episode covered some fairly meaty material, I think, about the new constitution writing process. So now we're going to turn, to a slightly lighter subject, or not so light, which is property.
Yes, part of our special on property and
areas and things like that in Chile, in Santiago, basically. Because Pete, you've been known to haunt, or you have haunted Valparaiso for many years, but you've now committed to Santiago, haven't you?
Could you believe that this morning closed down the Valparaiso operation and wholly dedicated to Santiago? Apart from all the times I can leave the country or the city. Yes.
Now, where Pete lives in Santiago is in the municipality of Providencia, which is quite a large one. He lives the other side of what to me is a very important dividing line. Okay, I live in Ñuñoa, and we're going to perhaps talk a bit about what is Ñuñoa. This is a district named after some Chilean flower that I don't think anybody could now recognise. It may even be extinct, due to the action of human feet trampling it down in this area as they sort of built a suburb of Santiago. And it's got a particular reputation, which, tell us about it, Pete. How do you see us from the outside?
From Providencia, well, I think every large city likes to have some territorial stereotypes. The particular niche of Ñuñoa is an interesting one because I think it's generally agreed that there's what is called the eastern sector to the north of Ñuñoa. Ñuñoa is kind of immediately to the south of Providencia, just not quite within the concept of the eastern sector.
But
I think
it can be included or not. So the eastern sector is the wealthy sector essentially. And I think Ñuñoa does essentially, I would say, belong to it.
Yes, of course, as you would say.
That's right.
Living here.
Yeah.
But interestingly, Ñuñoa seems to get loaded with the role of the kind of hip or progressive place within society. I'm not entirely sure how much it lives up to it, but there is evidence that are slightly more progressive.
Yeah.
Kind
Well,
of
one strong piece of evidence was that when the constitution, the proposed constitution, was voted on not long ago, the country, almost to a man, rejected it. But it was approved in a handful of municipalities in the whole country, right? One of which was Ñuñoa. Were there any others in Santiago?
Yes, but poorer areas. It was certainly the wealthiest area of Santiago.
To approve a constitution that was clearly against its economic interests, I suppose. So it's and it's not mixed. So you could say it's kind of Islington. You could say it's what Hampstead was in the 1930s. I don't know what Islington certainly was in the 1980s and even the 2000s. I'm not sure if Islington still is, because I'm quite out of touch with it.
It'd be Hackney now. I think Hackney would be the new Islington.
Hackney, yeah, something like that. Maybe it's Hackney. Stoke Newington, where I also used to live. So I think a friend, a kind of fairly right-wing friend of mine, calls me a conservative hippie, and maybe that's part of the profile of the people who live here, And it's an odd mixture. It was always associated with people like teachers, middle class, not wealthy. Clearly it went downhill. There's a lot of lovely old solid houses, these Ley Pereira law houses we mentioned in a previous episode. Very solidly built, very nicely designed. I'm renting one at the moment. Really create a very attractive cityscape, and they're pretty expensive to buy, not by London standards, but you're talking about 300,000, £500,000, and a lot of them are fairly run down. Like in this very passage I live in, we could go around with the camera, but there's one, tin roof, sort of windows with bits of, polythene in. It's a very run down looking. So if you were to buy them now, they cost a lot of money. But
well, in Santiago, there is, in a lot of Latin America, there was a style of housing, kind of shared housing, called the conventillo, which was basically kind of converted large house, which would turn into a multi-family house. And in the middle part of last century, there was a new style called the cité. And here, a lot of the construction is the cité style, which has a large driveway with a gate, certain security features, and basically a kind of court of houses around it. And I would probably describe this as a cité. I'm not an architectural expert, but...
Right, you might just about qualify. We call it a closed passage, which is what it is, but you could also call it a cité, probably, yeah.
Yes.
And so, Ñuñoa has got these nice old houses and, quite upmarket parts, or places that are becoming more and more upmarket. And then a lot of new blocks of flats being built. So I mean, for one whose tastes run to old things and old houses, and solid old things, there's actually an area of Ñuñoa, for those in the know, which is, well, certainly west of Ossa, which is the kind of urban stretch of the big motorway ring road where it actually plunges into Santiago. Certainly west of there, actually several blocks west of there, practically up to here really, to Montenegro in the east. Then in the west, a kind of block or so east of Los Leones. And then after that, you go west of that and you get into Pete's area, okay, which is east of that is still Florencia, but it's pretty much like Ñuñoa, this bit of Ñuñoa. There's a continuum of these nice streets, old houses, sort of not that uniform, but a mixture of kind of, sort of fairly pleasant styles. And then you get west, you get to Los Leones or a bit before, and then you get into this other bit of Providencia, which is still fairly moneyed, but it's a lot of blocks of flats,
Yes. Well, a lot of, as I think we mentioned in our previous special on Santiago, there's been a lot of destruction of quite nice architecture in Providencia. That's happening in Ñuñoa, but not to the same extent.
It's happened a lot though, and it's Latin America. I mean, not entirely. I know in Brazil and other countries, in Mexico, they have preserved some really quite substantial old cities. But in the southern part of South America, in South America, I mean, Argentina, I have been told that there is no city or even town of any considerable size that is old. Everything is just demolished. And here in Chile, it's pretty much so as well, isn't it?
Yes, I think some kind of heritage protection is gradually sinking in. My theory was always that there would be a new government in Chile, and the president would have a niece who had done some kind of heritage studies course in an English-speaking country, who would become some kind of sub-secretary of heritage and kind of rescue some areas. There's a little bit of that in
it is happening. It is happening, and in the centre, because the centre was once rich, and is now quite poor. Fairly large parts have actually been left fairly untouched. It just wasn't worth demolishing and building blocks of flats because not enough people with money wanted to live there. And so, of course, the owners of these old houses are forced to keep them as they are. And often for them, the easiest thing to do is simply let them deteriorate to the point where they have to be demolished for safety reasons. I often thought, looking at Buenos Aires, what a pity. They should have declared the whole, historical city a conservation area, and then these countries have got so much land. You just build some other cities sort of next to it and hope to some high-speed train lines, whatever. Because you think, well, in that case, you have these huge old urban areas that are inhabited by poor people, and eventually they just fall down. I mean, like Havana, I suppose. I think that's happened to some extent.
Yes. Yes. Ñuñoa has a considerable integrity, I think, compared to other parts of Santiago, but we don't know the mechanism for that, do we?
We don't know the mechanism, but we do know, that there are lots of nice kind of Ponzi cafes, which I enjoy repairing, and it does feel quite chic, and there's even the blocks of flats and everything. But we should do a bit more to justify this reputation of Ñuñoa about it being progressive, really. But do we have actually any more knowledge?
Well, I mean, there was a case of one of the local emblematic schools here, where the director,
the headmaster, I suppose.
The headmaster.
I
mean, I would have to get my. I don't want to get the wires too crossed. But the headmaster came up against the community, and the headmaster was seen to be too standards oriented and drummed out. We should get to the bottom of that story, but there is this interesting concept in Chile in particular called the progre, the progressive, which it's hard to put your finger on what the progre is.
Maybe in a lot of cases, I mean, Ñuñoa is known for having some relatively good state schools. So the Manuel de Salas, Calasanz, places like that, which, when you start, if you have children in this country, you start looking for schools. I mean, pretty much all the state schools are pretty dire, and if you've got the money, you tend to go private, but then you get to the private schools, and you find they fall into, almost all of them, into very few categories. Okay? One of them is a kind of the fake English school, which if you're actually sort of English or something, feels a bit kind of weird, to send your children to, right? There are various kind of Montessori, Waldorf, but, and then the other group is essentially Catholic schools, of which there are a lot. And my older children went to a Catholic school just up the road, not in Ñuñoa, but just up in Las Condes, called the Instituto Teresiano. And it was billed as a Catholic school, but a very approachable one, where normal people could send their children, with complete sort of confidence, without being sort of embarrassed. So I was quite startled when, in the first, parents' meeting, we were all told that we were now going to speak to Jesus, and so we had to sit down and sort of speak in our hearts to Jesus, and then that was kind of okay, all right, but then we had to say what Jesus had said to us, which for the kind of less Catholic among us was quite tricky, Luckily somebody had spoken at great length with Jesus, who told him that I think he should take his daughter more often to the kind of supermarket. It was something quite prosaic, and they didn't get around to me. So, that's a light Catholic school. That's a very light, where they accept divorced parents and things like that, okay, The other Catholic schools are not so light, and there are a lot of them, and they are the main type of schools, other, as I say, than the kind of the Alliance Française, the Scuola Italiana, and then a number of kind of supposed English schools, So that gives you a measure. One comes here and you don't really get the feeling of a very Catholic country, I would say. For a start, I mean, here in Ñuñoa, most parts of Santiago, you do not notice any churches. And then you start to realise there are more churches than you realise. They just don't look like churches, because they're these kind of modern Catholic churches that look like sort of, like a bit of Swiss cheese, juxtaposed against a kind of, village hall, or something like that. You didn't recognise it as a church. If you go to Recoleta, then you see plenty of lovely old churches, But the rest of Santiago, you just don't notice them. And so this Catholicism is actually quite well buried. So I'm rambling on here, so I'm getting onto a bit of a hobby horse. Feel free to break in.
Well, Chile did have a fairly ferocious Vatican II vibe in the 1960s, which was associated with the progressivism of the time, such as the Christian Democrat movement in the 1960s, that was sort of socially conscious and so on. I mean, if you compare that to, say, Argentina, where the historical middle class political representation came from the radical orientation, which is Freemasonry, and typically opposed to Catholicism. But by the 1980s, after Argentina's big military government from 1976 to 1984, there was actually a fusion of the Catholic element and the radical Mason element there. That's never quite been put back together because it was a disastrous government, the government of Alfonsín in the late 80s, ending in hyperinflation. So Argentina, I think, has completely exhausted any kind of Catholic representation, whereas in Chile, it is still an undercurrent. There is a more liberal element to it, and there is a more conservative element to it.
That's right, but it's true. In Argentina, going out on a limb, I don't know the country that well, but you do get the feeling of being in a more normal. It's such an abnormal country in so many ways. It's like one of the top 10 most economically unfree countries in the world. At the same time, it's being quite liberal socially and politically. Really, it's very unoppressive. The police look like sort of hippies, essentially. So it's down smoking with long hair, whatever. Lipstick. Very weird mixture. But in that respect, it feels to a kind of modern European fairly normal. And Chile, you would think at a glance that it is also normal by that European secular standard, and especially when they elect these governments, which are clearly apparently don't have any religious component at all, and you start to realise that actually this is a bit of an illusion. And that underneath it, this Catholic thing is still very strong.
I think very much so. I mean, in the English-speaking world, we're comfortable enough with this post-Christian, which is essentially a sort of post-Anglican or post sort of low Protestant orientation.
Post-Kirk, post-Chapel, whatever.
Yes, which certainly doesn't have many adherents, but still is somehow an undercurrent within the sort of atheist majority or plurality of those places. It is the mainstream. I think in Chile there is a post-Catholic element, of which I would say that the Ñuñoino
I was getting around to this as well. Yeah, you go on. Yeah,
I think is an expression of that. I think the Frente Amplio movement that's currently leading the government or being led while leading the government at the moment, I think is very much a post-Catholic.
That's right. It's certainly not simply non-Catholic, definitely post-Catholic. That whole history is very much there, clearly. And so possibly, Ñuñoa seems progressive to the rest of Chile simply because it's got, these state schools that are kind of not Catholic. It's just simply less Catholic, possibly. And I'm not even sure of that because a lot of people have come in. The population's increased, a lot of flats have been built, so I can't. But possibly it just does have that slightly more secular feel to it. And it's just kind of a slightly more normal place, and that's why I feel at home here, even if I didn't myself vote for that constitution.
Yes, it's a good theory. Perhaps that is the niche that Ñuñoa.
Yeah, everybody laughs at it because it's normal, something like that. So there we are, this long excursus, through Catholicism, I think has brought us back to something. It can't be just chance that Ñuñoa has these great concentrations of secular state schools, and I think on that note, we can probably feel we've actually reached a conclusion with this episode.
Yes. Well, we're going to go into other elements of Ñuñoa because you're currently in the market for a house.
We will talk about, renting and buying houses on a future episode, in the near future, I hope.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much for joining us, and see you next time.
Ciao.